Welcome to the next episode of the Be Ready Utah PrepCast. I'm Wade Mathews, the manager of Be Ready Utah at the Division of Emergency Management. Joining me today are Bryan Stinson and James Ray, both emergency preparedness outreach specialists, and we are continuing our series of PrepCasts on water storage, the importance of water preparedness. So we are going to talk today about water storage itself, specifically the location and rotation and those types of things, the containers, right? So why don't we go ahead and start with that. Bryan, what do you want to begin with there?
Well, the one thing you want to think about anytime you're storing water or anything else, three things: cool, dark, and dry. That's your best storage locations for any place that you're going to be putting anything. When it's cool, it keeps potential contaminants from growing. It keeps whatever it is you're storing, it keeps it in a more stable state. When it's dark, sunlight affects things, not only the container, but whatever it is you're storing in a bad way as well. And then dry, anytime there's moisture in some place that you're trying to store something, if there's moisture there, things start to grow. And if things start to grow, they produce contaminants, and it can contaminate what you're storing. So cool, dark, and dry. Those are three things you want for storage.
And where do we find those characteristics at? In your basement, obviously, you know, if it meets those conditions, that's a great place to store. A lot of people wonder about, well, in an earthquake, can I get to my basement? You know, to get to that water storage I've been storing there? What if my house is damaged and I can't get to it? You do the best with what you have, right? Whatever your conditions are, you do the best with the space you have. But that is ideally the location that you'd want to store water in.
When you bring up a good point there, you know, there's an old axiom of you don't store all your eggs in one basket. The best place to store things is in your basement. But, you know, it's also a good idea to keep water stores on other floors of the home. You might want to keep some up in the basement, behind, you know, underneath the sink, something like that. Store some out in the garage as well. Those aren't ideal places, but it's good to have lots of different places to store water.
And again, cool and dark is obviously going to be inside. But what about storing outside? We got a question from one of our viewers, Catherine. She asked, in the event you don't have a north side condo unit, is it okay to store on the south side? And I assume she's referring to outside of the building itself. You want to be careful about a lot of direct sunlight and freezing in the extreme temperatures as well. But what about outside storage?
Well, that's again, we talked about ideal is in your basement. Not as ideal, maybe out in the garage, other places like that. And then better than nothing is outside. And if you can store it, excuse me, on the north side of your home where it's out of direct sunlight. But if that's not possible, in emergency preparedness, there's ideal. That's where are the best place to do things and store things. But then there's also the reality of what we have, what we can do, what we can afford. And something is always better than nothing. So if you can't store it in those ideal storage conditions, store it in the best place that you can. That's what you can do. Again, something is always better than nothing.
Exactly. Great. So a little bit more about the containers themselves. What kind of containers should we be looking for, James, for ideal water storage?
Well, something that I've seen in the past, there's containers like this that you sometimes see in people's homes. The one thing that you want to look for on the bottom, though, is a little symbol. The kind
recycling symbol.
Yeah, the recycling symbol. Mm-hmm. If it has a number 1 on it, that's not typically the kind of container that you want for long-term storage. It might work for short-term needs. But something like this probably wouldn't do for long-term storage. But one kind of container that you may see often for long-term storage are oftentimes those big blue-style containers. Mm-hmm. But there are other smaller containers that have that number 2 symbol on it.
Exactly. The number 2, 4, and 5 are all food-grade plastics. Those are intended more for that long-term storage and will have a less tendency to start leaching any chemicals into the water. Right. So do you have any other thoughts on containers, Bryan?
Well, usually the ones with the 2, it also has an HDPE, high-density polyethylene. And again, like James was saying, that's just your ideal storage containers for long-term storage. And as James is showing with our little water bottles here, you know, those are great. If this is what you have, that's great. It won't last as long. You'll just need to make sure you rotate it every couple of years or so. But this is a perfectly viable water storage container as well. you can put out the money to get the number 2 HDPE containers, and those will last you many years for water storage.
So we're talking about the 50-gallon barrels. I've got some 33-gallon barrels. We've got the 5-gallon containers,
Sure.
1 gallon, and even those smaller drinking bottles. Whatever you have, just store water. Can't emphasize that enough, to store water. Now, how often do we need to rotate that water?
Well, that's a good question, and it has a little bit of background behind that. One thing that you want to think about when you're filling your storage containers is you want to make sure you're filling it up with not your just typical garden hose, but with a drinking water hose. They're usually white. They're sometimes called RV hoses, boat hoses, many different names, but it's a drinking water hose. And if you fill it up with municipal water, with a clean drinking water hose, and you fill it up in a clean container, that water should last you a very, very long time. I mean,
Indefinitely,
5 years,
in fact.
Indefinitely.
USU Extension Service did a study in 2005 that determined if your water was treated when it was stored, meaning came out of a culinary system like you're talking about, there's no need to rotate it. I think that's a big concern people have, and a reason why they don't store in the first place. They don't know what to do with those containers and what kind, and they're worried about rotating the water. If it was treated when it was stored, don't worry about it. Put it in there and just use it when you need it in that disaster situation. If you do question the purity of your water, boil it. And we're going to talk more about purification in our next segment. But, and again, the white water hose, ideal. We're talking a lot about the difference between ideal and possibly realistic. I used a garden hose. I let the water run through the hose. I drink out of the hose all the time. I let the water run through that hose before I filled up my containers. And you fill them up to the top. Keep that lid as tight as you can. And as Bryan said earlier, in a cool, dark place. And that water should last indefinitely.
Okay. Another thing you may want to consider is not to store your containers directly on the ground or on the cement. A good idea is to put up some 2x4s. That's an easy, simple thing to do. 2x4s that can lift it up off the ground, maybe a pallet, something. It just allows air to circulate underneath the container and prevents condensation from the coolness of your storage container and the cement. Prevents that condensation that can promote growth from bacteria, from other organisms that again can create toxins that can leach eventually into your water storage.
Okay, great, perfect. And that answers this question from Cooking Up a Storm, who said, I read somewhere that if I leave the plastic jugs on the cement basement floor, the chemicals from the floor will leach into it. Is that true? So essentially, there's a risk of that happening. So get it up off the concrete, as you just mentioned.
And the risk of chemicals and things from your floor, it's almost negligible compared to what could happen with that moisture buildup.
Okay. Did we cover everything we wanted to today?
I think we're good for storage.
One question that I've heard from people is, what do I do for water storage in a vehicle?
Okay.
I mean, because you can't have the big water barrels inside of your car, right? Obviously. But your vehicle is subject to high temperatures and really cold temperatures. And what does that do to your water storage, and what do you want to start thinking about?
That's a good question. A lot of times what I recommend to people is having some of those smaller containers. We've had our little water bottle up here.
The drinking bottles. That's what we have in our vehicle.
That's a great thing to have in your car. You'll just need to rotate it more often. Sometimes you may want to have a little bit more flexible container, depending on what you have. I mean, there's Mylar bags that I know you can store water in. That's a good option for storing in a car as well. There's little personal Mylar pouches of water that are great, 5-year, no matter what the temperature are, storage containers for in your car. Now, one thing you want to think about during the winter time, that's when we're recording this, is that water could be frozen. So you may need to have some kind of means of warming up that water if that water's frozen inside and you need to drink it, because you don't want to put, especially in very cold conditions, you don't want to be putting frozen water in your mouth that'll lower your body temperature. So have a means of warming up that water if necessary for inside your car. But great question.
Yeah, just keeping in mind what can happen to it in the extremes. Okay, I think we're out of time for this segment. Thank you for watching Be Ready Utah PrepCast. Again, these are available on our YouTube page, Be Ready Utah YouTube page, and our website, BeReadyUtah.gov. We've also got a great brochure there on water storage on our website, BeReadyUtah.gov. You can print it off, download it, read it there, and get more of this great information about water storage on our website. So next segment, we will have one more segment. We're talking about water treatment, so make sure you tune in. Thanks for watching.